Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Hold on tight, because the story I'm about to tell is brutal, beautiful, and near impossible to shake. This is the true Old West, not the postcard version, but the dust-choked, blood-stained truth, where civilization runs out and survival begins. Where danger wears both badges and war paint, and where two broken souls strike together like flint and steel. Everything changed the moment a shattered widow crossed paths with a man the world called a savage, and he looked her in the eye and spoke the 5 most dangerous words she'd ever hear. I need a woman, and you need a home. One sentence. One choice, a lifetime set ablaze. If that sent a chill through you, hit like and tell me, where are you listening from? The wind shrieked across the endless Texas flats, dragging red dust and old sorrow through the air like a funeral veil snapping in a storm. A lone woman moved along a faint game trail, step by step. Her boots were caked in ochre mud, and the hem of her skirt had gone stiff with trail dirt. Maren Vail. Once the shining young bride of a wealthy cattle baron, she now walked the frontier utterly alone, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and the ragged scraps of her pride. She had not always been a drifter. Just 3 months before, Maren Vail had been the woman every lady in Hillstone County secretly envied. Hair like sunburned gold, eyes bright as desert turquoise. She had married Barrett Crow, a man old enough to be her father, but rich enough that no one dared say much where he could hear it. She played her part without a misstep. Gentle smiles at church socials, quiet, capable management of the sprawling ranch, patient company through his worsening spells of sickness. And when Barrett Crow fell dead from a seizure of the heart, Maren Vail put on widow's black and carried herself with a still, restrained dignity. She thought she had earned at least something. Maybe a small house at the edge of the property, maybe a modest monthly allowance to live plain and decent. But the will was cold on that matter, and silent. Crowkin came riding in with practiced sympathy and smug half-smiles, and within days their true faces showed. They called her a fortune hunter, said she'd bewitched a dying man with nothing but a pretty face. Childless and without legal claim, Maren Vail was given 24 hours to leave with only the clothes on her back and whatever she could force into a single bag. Not one soul in town stepped forward to help her. There were pitying looks, a few hushed whispers. Nothing more. In a hard frontier settlement, a young widow with beauty and no protection was trouble wrapped in lace. She became a ghost before she was ever allowed to grieve. So now Maren Vail drifted west toward nowhere in particular, just away. Away from accusing stares, two-faced friends, and the choking weight of her dead husband's name. She had heard rumors of trading posts scattered along the old cattle trails, places where settlers, drifters, traders, and even wanted men could find a meal, a bed, or a day's work if pride didn't get in the way. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She only knew the horizon felt wider than the memories chasing her. Her plan was simple. Keep walking until the past blew apart behind her like dust. By the 5th day, her boots were splitting at the seams, and her shoulders burned from the carpet-bag strap. She had not eaten since the morning before, save for a dry wedge of cornbread handed to her without a word by a grizzled old trapper named Toller Graves, who had passed her on the trail. That night she camped beside a shallow wash, gathered a little fire from sun-bleached driftwood, and prayed the flames would hold till morning. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Stars burned cold and close overhead. The vast silence of the wild settled over her like a heavy quilt. But Maren Vail was no delicate flower. Though the polished manners of her old life still shaped the way she spoke and carried herself, something harder, something wilder had begun to grow down deep inside her, a stubborn fire born of betrayal. She pulled her shawl tighter, drew her father's old revolver close, and leaned back against a broad, flat stone. Exhaustion rolled over her like thick fog. Her eyes slipped shut. She woke to the slow, heavy thud of hooves. Maren Vail jerked upright, fingers clamping around the pistol grip. The fire had collapsed into ash. Pale dawn light spilled over the ridge. A man stood before her, if man was big enough a word for him. He was towering, broad as a barn door, and still as carved granite. His bare chest caught the morning light despite the chill. Faded war paint marked his arms beside fresh, angry scars. Long black hair fell down his back like spilled ink. An Apache, no question. But he looked nothing like the bloodthirsty monsters from settlers' campfire tales. He watched her without hunger, without rage. His face was no sneer, no grin. Maren Vail raised the revolver without a tremor. "Stay back," she said, forcing iron into her voice. The giant tipped his head and glanced at the pistol like it was a child's toy. "If I wanted you dead," he said in calm, perfect English, "you would not still be holding that gun." Maren Vail kept the barrel trained on him, but her breath caught. English, deep, steady, measured, spoken like a man taught in schoolrooms, not war camps. That shook her worse than any war cry ever could. "What do you want?" she asked, never taking her eyes off him. He paused. Then he moved closer, slow, deliberate, and sank to one knee beside the dead fire ring. He set a small cloth bundle on the ground between them. Jerky and hardtack. Maren Vail stared at the offering, then lifted her eyes back to his face. He held her gaze with a quiet, steady certainty. "You don't belong to the people who cast you out," he said. "And this land doesn't care a damn thing about pride." Maren Vail said nothing. "I need a woman," he added, rising to his full, towering height. "And you need a home." Then he turned, walked back to his horse, and left her there with the silence, the food, and a choice that felt heavier than the sky. Maren Vail sat motionless long after the hoofbeats faded into the waking prairie. The small bundle lay unopened at her feet. His words stayed in the cool morning air like the last thread of smoke from a dead campfire. "I need a woman, and you need a home." She could not decide what cut deeper, the bluntness of it, the plain truth inside it, or the total absence of threat in his voice. There had been no hunger in his eyes, no swagger, no hand reaching for her arm. He had not leered, bargained, or demanded. He had only said it the way a man might remark that the wind was blowing west. She opened the bundle with careful fingers. The jerky was tough, smoky, heavy with salt and survival. The bread was dense, still faintly warm. She ate slowly, eyes fixed on the empty line of horizon where the giant had disappeared. Her revolver stayed close at hand, but something low in her gut whispered he was truly gone, or at least gone far enough to leave the choosing to her. Out here, the land forgave nothing. Drought had split the earth open. Wind had scoured away every trace of mercy. No church steeple broke the sky, no town square promised shelter or gossip. No one would come looking if she lived or died on that barren rise. By mid-morning, Maren Vail packed her few things and started walking again. Not east, toward the life that had spit her out. Not south, toward dusty settlements and old whispers. West, toward the way the stranger had ridden. The sun was leaning toward afternoon when she saw him again. He sat waiting on a high, rocky shelf, easy in the saddle of a paint Mustang, still as stone. Soren. That was the name he had given her the night before, though she still did not know whether it was a name, a title, or something in between. Against the blood-red wash of sunset, he looked carved from the land itself, too stark, too still, too perfectly made for a place this empty. As she came closer, he did not move. Only when she drew near enough to speak did he give the slightest nod. "Didn't think you'd come after me." "I didn't," Maren Vail said, her voice level. "I just kept walking the same direction you went." A faint flicker of humor touched his hard face. "That's how wolves choose their pack." She arched one brow. "And what makes you think I'd follow a wolf?" "Because you don't look like a lamb." Maren Vail did not answer. She did not need to. The lift of her chin said enough. Without another word, he turned his horse and gestured toward the second mount he had brought. A tall Appaloosa mare with bright, knowing eyes. The reins hung loose, waiting. Maren Vail paused, fingertips brushing the leather. "Where exactly are we going?" "Home," Soren said. "You're assuming a great deal." He looked back at her from the saddle. "I'm not assuming anything. I'm offering. You choose." The quiet humility in his tone caught her off guard. No command, no claim, just an open road. Maren Vail set her jaw, stepped up, and swung into the saddle. They rode in near silence for the better part of an hour, crossing shallow draws and brittle scrub until the land began to rise. At last they slipped through a narrow cut between crumbling canyon walls, and the world opened into a hidden valley, green with cottonwood, alive with the low murmur of a spring-fed stream. Near the tree line stood a low structure, half-hide lodge, half-log cabin, built from scavenged timber, stretched hides, and rough stone. It was not large, but it looked solid. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted from the chimney. Bundles of drying herbs swayed beneath the eaves. There was no one else in sight. "You live here?" Maren Vail asked as she slid carefully from the saddle. "For now," Soren said. "Far enough from the Apache war bands, close enough when they call." She watched him as he unloaded the packs. "And who are you, exactly?" He glanced at her, then back to his work. "More than I wanted. Less than I was meant to be." The words carried an old, bone-deep weariness. Maren Vail studied him. For all his size and strength, there was no vanity on him. He moved like a man who had survived too many fights, too many hard winters, and learned not to ask for more than the next sunrise. Inside, the place was surprisingly orderly. Dried meat, folded furs, a few books stacked neatly on a shelf. One of them caught her eye. Plutarch's Lives, in English. She paused, studying the shelf, then looked back at him. "You read Latin?" Soren gave a slight shrug. "Missionaries taught me." He paused, then added, "Before I killed one." She turned toward him slowly. "Is that supposed to impress me or scare me?" "Neither," Soren said. "Just the truth." Maren Vail lowered herself onto a three-legged stool and held his gaze. "So what happens now? I stay here and, what, warm your blankets? Cook your supper?" Soren looked at her for a long moment. "No. You survive the way I do. And if one day you choose to walk out that door, I won't stop you." Maren Vail let out a slow breath.
For a moment, the silence between them was not empty. It crackled, lived, full of possibility. This was not ownership. It was not rescue. It was something raw, something with no name yet. "Then I stay," she said quietly. Soren gave one short nod and crouched to build up the fire.
That first night, the flames snapped and danced between them, throwing long shadows across the rough hide walls. Maren Vail sat cross-legged on a thick buffalo robe, watching the firelight move over his face. Her eyes kept drifting back to Soren as he moved through the small cabin with the calm, unhurried certainty of a man long accustomed to being alone. Trust did not come easy. Not yet. Not even close. And there was no reason it should. She trusted the food he placed before her because hunger gave her no choice. She accepted the roof above her because the high plains cold did not care a damn about pride or propriety. But the man himself? He was still a mystery. Too steady, too strong, too still. It was not only his size, though Soren was, without question, the largest and most commanding man she had ever stood near. It was the way he carried all that strength. Like a boulder that could crush everything in its path, yet chose not to move unless it had to. After a long stretch of quiet, he finally spoke. "Your name isn't Widow." Maren Vail lifted her eyes to him. "No. It's Maren Vail." She held his gaze. "Yes." "You're still wearing black." He tipped his chin toward the dark dress clinging to her like a shadow. "Not because I'm mourning my husband," she said, her voice cool and even. "Because it reminds people I used to be more than some stray nobody took pity on." Soren raised one brow. "You reminding them? Or yourself?" She went still. No one had ever asked her that plain. "Maybe both," she admitted after a moment. He nodded once, like he was setting the answer aside in some private place he rarely let anyone see. Maren Vail studied him in return. His skin was hardened by sun and weather, though smooth in places. Faded markings crossed his broad chest, tattoos worn by time. Eagles in flight, flames curling upward. Old Apache symbols woven with something more personal, more private. His thick black hair was tied back with narrow strips of red trade cloth, and the way he looked at her was nothing like other men. No hunger, no claim, no desperation. Only clear, steady attention. He saw her, truly saw her, without trying to own what he saw. "You speak English like a man who went to school," she said at last. "Had a teacher once," Soren replied, leaning back against the rough log wall. "For a while. Then I didn't." "You mentioned killing a missionary." He did not flinch, did not look away. "I said it happened. I never said I was proud of it." She let that settle between them, heavy as iron. Then, in a low but steady voice, she asked, "What do you want from me?" "I told you. A woman." "That's a mighty vague answer." "I know." She folded her arms, daring him to say more. He stared into the fire a long time before he spoke again. "It means someone who doesn't jump every time I open my mouth. Someone who doesn't need me to pretend I'm anything other than what I am. Someone who doesn't curse this land whenever the wind turns mean." He paused, jaw tightening just slightly. "Someone who might stay." His words settled over the room like wood smoke, slow, thick, impossible to ignore. "I'm no tame thing," Maren Vail said. "You give me food. You give me a bed under a roof,
but don't expect me to sit pretty at your boots waiting on scraps." Across the firelight, Soren met her eyes. Something shifted there. More than amusement. Maybe respect. Maybe recognition. "Good," he said simply. Another silence came, but this one felt different. Less like a standoff. More like two bruised souls taking each other's measure, trading the only thing they had left worth offering. The truth. Then Maren Vail rose, crossed the room, and pushed the door open. Cold night air poured in, carrying sage and pine on the wind.
Stars spread thick across the hidden valley, brighter than anything Maren Vail had ever seen back near town. A pale moon hung low above the cottonwoods. Behind her, Soren spoke again. "There are rules, Maren Vail. You are no prisoner here, but this is Apache land." He let the words settle before continuing. "Enemies are everywhere. Whites. Others. If they find you with me, they'll say I stole you. You'll have to choose soon, hide or run." She turned, her shape cut sharp against the starlight. "I'm not scared of enemies anymore. You should be." Her voice stayed steady, but it carried old hurt. "I used to be afraid of in-laws in fine coats who smiled while they slid the knife in. Afraid of whispers. Afraid of being proper. That kind of fear makes you small." She shook her head. Out here, the danger tells the truth." He looked at her again, and this time something softer, almost grief, passed across his face. "I won't ask twice. Stay the night. Leave at first light if you want." He held her eyes. "Either way, I won't chase you." Maren Vail met his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then she shut the door, crossed back to the bench, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and settled against the wall near the dying fire. "I'll decide in the morning," she murmured. Soren gave one short nod, stretched out on his pallet across the room, and turned his back to her. Two strangers. Two storms. One small fire snapping between them. Maren Vail woke before dawn. The embers still glowed faint red. The cabin sat in a thick hush, broken only by the slow, even sound of Soren breathing from the far side of the room. She did not remember falling asleep. One moment she had been staring into the fire's restless glow. The next, darkness had rolled over her, heavy and close, like a wool blanket pulled too tight. She lay still for a long while, letting the quiet settle deep. Her eyes moved across the room. Neat bundles of dried herbs hanging in careful rows. The deliberate order of a man who lived with purpose. A rough table shaped by hand. No wasted space, no ornaments, no softness spared for show. No excess. Not even room meant for her. She was the only new thing in that place, and the truth of it sat heavy in her chest. Slowly, Maren Vail pushed herself up, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the sharp edge of dawn. Frost glittered over the grass like scattered glass. The sky was turning from deep violet to cold steel blue. A thin mist drifted along the creek near the grove. She could leave right then. No one would stop her. Not Soren. Not the wild country itself. Her legs still had strength. Her mind still worked clear. The nearest trading post was a hard day's march. If luck held, some traveler might spare her a meal, maybe even a ride back toward what people called civilization. But civilization was the very thing that had stripped her down and thrown her away like worn cloth. Her gaze settled on the Appaloosa Soren had left for her, still tied near the cottonwoods. She had a horse. She had a trail. But for the first time in weeks, her belly was not clawing with hunger. Her bones were not shaking from cold, and no one was looking at her like something to be bought or a problem to be handled. She was simply a person. The cabin door creaked behind her. She did not turn. "You're up," Soren said, his voice rough with sleep. "So are you." A quiet beat passed. "You were thinking of leaving." "I was," she said. Then, after a breath, "Still am." He did not answer at once. She heard his slow footsteps come closer, then stop a respectful distance behind her. She kept her back to him. "You don't fit in those towns anymore," he said quietly. "No," Maren Vail answered. "And you don't fit with the bands anymore either." Silence again. But this silence had weight, like cool water sinking into cracked earth. At last, Maren Vail turned to face him. Early light washed his face in silver, sharp cheekbones, a hard jaw, eyes carrying the memory of too many storms. "Why did you offer me shelter?" she asked. "Because I saw someone who didn't flinch," Soren said. "Someone who wouldn't beg. I'm not here looking to be saved. I'm not offering salvation." He stepped closer. Frost crunched under his bare feet. He held her gaze without wavering. "I told you what I need. I won't sweeten it." His voice stayed low and steady. "I'm not looking for a servant, not a toy, not someone to help me forget my scars. I want a woman who carries her own hurt and doesn't apologize for it." He paused, and something older moved behind his eyes. "Someone who might sit beside my fire on long nights. Someone who might give me a reason to quit wrestling ghosts." Maren Vail studied him. The words were not polished, not gentle. But they were honest, rough and bare in a way that unsettled her and steadied her all at once. "What do I get out of it?" she asked. His voice dropped lower. "A home. Safety. A man who will never ask you to make yourself smaller just to fit beside him," Soren said. Then, after a beat, "And freedom. Inside these walls or outside them. Whenever you want it." Maren Vail studied him, arms folded tight. "You truly let me walk away?" He nodded once. "Any day you choose. That's part of the deal." She weighed him in silence. "You call this a bargain?" "I call it a deal," Soren said. "Not love. Not yet. Just two broken souls seeing whether they can stand side by side without breaking each other." A slow breath left Maren Vail, misting pale in the cold air. She had made plenty of deals in her life, most of them unspoken. Some she regretted the instant they were made. But this one felt different. It offered nothing she had not already paid for in blood and betrayal. No false promises, no pretty lies. Only the right to choose. She met his eyes again.
"And if I stay? Then what?"
"We live," Soren said, "and we see what comes."
It was no vow carved in stone, no demand dipped in sweetness. It was real, plain, hard, honest. And after all she had survived, real mattered more than romance ever could. Maren Vail held out her hand. "Then I accept the deal. For now." He took it. His palm was rough, warm, steady. He did not pull her closer or close his grip too hard. He simply held her hand like an equal, like the touch itself sealed something deeper than a preacher's blessing or a banker's paper. Maren Vail had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in months, She had chosen her own ground instead of being shoved onto somebody else's. And that, she realized, was a kind of strength no one could steal.
By the second morning, Maren Vail had already learned the exact way the sunlight cut through the cottonwoods, turning the valley floor gold. She was beginning to feel the pulse of the place, the crows gathering by the creek at first light, the low whistle of wind slipping through the canyon like a far-off warning shot, the clean scent of pine sap hanging over everything like a promise no one spoke aloud. She was beginning to learn Soren's rhythms too. He rose before dawn every day. No noise, no fuss, just steady, purposeful motion. No one had to tell him what needed doing. He split firewood with clean, deadly accuracy, hauled water from the spring without complaint, moved through brush and stone like the land itself had shaped him. Maren Vail watched him often, half curious, half guarded. He never tried to impress her, never explained himself unless asked. It was as if her presence did not shatter the life he had built out there alone. It only shifted the balance a little. Still, every inch of her resisted settling in. For years she had lived by other people's rules, first her father's expectations, then Barrett Crow's quiet demands, then the smug smiles of Crow kin who watched her being thrown out and called it justice. To feel grateful for a man's roof? No. That was not why she had come this far. And yet the days began to soften at the edges. The hard walls she had built inside herself were wearing smooth. The cabin was small, but Soren had quietly cleared a corner on the far side for her. A simple cot, a little cedar chest, even a strip of faded calico hung as a curtain for privacy. She had not asked for any of it. He never mentioned it. It was simply there. Plain kindness, without strings. On the fourth day, Maren Vail finally broke the quiet between them. She was by the hearth slicing dried roots when she asked, "You always live alone?" Across the fire, Soren drew a wet stone slowly along the edge of his hunting knife. I've ridden with camps, raiding parties, soldier outfits. He glanced up. But yes, mostly alone. Why? He watched her for a long moment before answering the question she had not yet asked. Too wide for the Apache, he said quietly. Too Apache for the whites. Her knife stopped mid-cut. The words struck deeper than she expected. You don't sound like a man who belongs nowhere, Maren Vail said carefully. That's because I quit trying to belong. The answer landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Silence stretched for a few heartbeats. Then she asked, softer this time, Do you want me to belong here? He did not hesitate. Only if you choose it. Her hand began moving again, slicing roots in a slow, steady rhythm. You don't make this easy. I shouldn't. They held each other's gaze then, long, level, carrying understanding and something close to respect. That evening, Maren Vail wandered a short distance from the cabin, drawn by the low call of an owl somewhere in the dark. The air had gone cool and sharp with wild sage. She stood still with her arms crossed, chin lifted, staring up at the stars, brighter than any chandelier she had ever seen in a ballroom. For the first time in years, she did not feel watched. She was simply there. She did not hear Soren come up behind her until he spoke, his voice low and steady. You don't trust comfort. She turned halfway toward him. I've learned better. He came to stand beside her, close enough to be felt, not crowded, not distant either. But you're still here, Soren said. Not gone yet, Maren Vail answered. His voice stayed low. Why do you think that is? She let out a slow breath and looked out over the dark ridge. Because this place doesn't ask me to pretend I'm somebody else. They stood together in silence, facing the night. She waited for him to speak again, to test the fragile thing taking shape between them, to reach for her, to push. He did none of it. Instead, she startled herself. Maren Vail lifted her hand and laid it lightly on his forearm, just above the wrist. Not a lover's touch, not desperate. Something simpler, steadier. She felt the heat of his skin, the hard line of muscle beneath it, the slow, even rise and fall of his breathing. "You said I could leave any time," she murmured. "I meant it." She raised her eyes to his. "And if I stay, but I don't give myself to you?" "You are not a prize to be won," Soren said. "You're a person. You decide what you give." Her throat tightened. No one had ever handed her that kind of choice without a trap tied to it. Back in her old life, everything had been a trade. Dowries, favors, appearances, smiles that cost too much. But out here, in that raw silence, she was being offered something rarer than kindness. The right to exist.
No performance. No price.
"I'll stay," Maren Vail said at last. "But I'm not here to be anybody's comfort." Soren nodded once. "Then stay like fire," he said, "not just warmth." And for the first time in her grown life, Maren Vail smiled. Not the practiced, polite smile she had worn for years, a real one. It came from something loosening deep in her chest. She never thought her palms would harden with calluses, or that her shoulders would ache from hauling water and snapping kindling. But they did. She never imagined silence between two people could feel truer than 1,000 words. With Soren, it did. The days moved in a strange, steady rhythm. Hard work, little talk, no need to fill every quiet. They did not dig through each other's pasts. He never asked about Barrett Crow or the life she had fled. She never pressed him about the years he had spent split between two worlds. The land itself seemed to forbid it. The wind carried only the present. But even in that calm, tension lived close. Not between them, around them. Because neither Maren Vail nor Soren truly belonged to the valley they had begun to call home. One afternoon, while she gathered wild herbs along the creek bank, the stillness split under the sharp thunder of hooves. Fast, hard, hostile. Maren Vail dropped low on instinct, her hand flashing to the small knife at her hip. Seconds later, 2 riders crested the ridge. Apache scouts. They saw her at once. Their horses slowed to a wary walk. The younger one was barely more than a boy, maybe 16. He spat out rapid Apache she could not understand. The older rider, broad-chested and tall in the saddle, dragged his gaze over her from boots to brow as if she were something strange the river had washed ashore. Maren Vail lifted her chin and held his stare without blinking. Then Soren appeared, riding down the slope at an easy pace, a long spear resting across his lap, not raised, but impossible to ignore. His face gave away nothing. His eyes locked on the 2 men. He spoke in Apache, voice low and edged with iron. Maren Vail did not know the words, but she knew the meaning. Hands off. The younger scout spat into the dirt. The older one snapped something back that made Soren's knuckles pale around the spear shaft. Then, without another word, both riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the trees. Soren waited until the hoofbeats were gone before turning to her. "They won't come back alone." "What did they say?" Maren Vail asked. "They wanted to know why I'm keeping a white woman on Apache land." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them you were not theirs to question." Later that night, the fire burned low, and the weight of the encounter hung in the room like smoke that would not clear.
At last, Maren Vail spoke.
You said you rode with their war bands. Thought they might take you back.
They did, Soren said. She looked at him. When they needed someone killed. His jaw tightened. You think they'll come for me? He did not answer right away. I crossed lines a long time ago, Maren Vail, he said at last. When white men killed my mother, and the Apache hanged my father for speaking the enemy's tongue, I quit choosing sides. Now I live in the cracks between two ruined worlds. Maren Vail understood that better than she wanted to. You chose me, she said slowly. And now both sides want to make you pay for it. Soren looked at her then, his face half in shadow, but open. I didn't choose you because it was safe, he said. I chose you because I saw fire in your eyes. I figured maybe, just maybe, you could live through this place. And if you can't? Maren Vail asked. Soren met her eyes, voice flat and certain. Then I bury you. And I kill the ones who did it.
She did not flinch. It was not swagger, not a threat thrown for effect. It was simple truth, spoken the same way everything between them was spoken. Plain. Real. After a beat, he added, or maybe you kill them yourself. That night, Maren Vail took apart her father's revolver by firelight. She oiled the barrel, checked the action, reset the grip with steady hands. The woman who once fluttered through garden parties like a caged songbird was gone. In her place stood something harder, sharper. Surviving was no longer enough. She was preparing. The next morning, Soren returned from scouting with fresh blood staining his sleeve. What happened? Maren Vail asked, her voice tight as wire. Who did that? He did not answer right away. He only looked at her, jaw set hard, storm-carved and silent. But she already knew. The two scouts had carried word back. Voices were rising against her. Against them. They did not want a white woman on Apache ground, just as settlers would never stomach an Apache man sheltering a pale woman with eyes that would not drop. They were no longer merely caught between worlds. They were becoming a threat to both. Maren Vail reached for the hunting knife on the shelf and slid it into her belt. If war is coming, she said, let them find both of us standing. Soren did not smile, but he gave one slow nod. Two outcasts, two sparks, and the dry wind already carried smoke in its breath. Rain came hard that night, the kind that split the sky open and washed the valley in cold silver. Maren Vail sat by the fire, watching water stream down the oiled hide window like nervous fingers tracing old scars. She had grown used to the quiet in that place. But tonight the silence felt different, heavier, waiting. The wind wailed like restless ghosts, urgent and uneasy. Soren had not returned. He had ridden out before first light, toward a distant ridge where smoke signals had curled the day before. A warning, he had said, and nothing more. He took only his bow and his usual silence, leaving Maren Vail alone with a rising dread. Her fingers tapped restless patterns against the table. The revolver lay beside her like an old dog that still knew how to bite. When the door finally swung open and Soren stepped inside, soaked through to the skin, Maren Vail shot to her feet. "You're late," she said, sharper than she meant. "I'm here," he answered. But the hard line of his jaw and the faraway look in his eyes told her whatever waited on that ridge had been no kindness. She followed him as he stripped off his soaked tunic and hung it near the flames. Old scars crossed his back,
some pale and jagged from years long gone, some angry and fresh. She had seen pieces of them before, never all at once. It was like looking at a map of every fight he had lived through.
"What happened?" she asked. "They know about you," Soren said without turning. "All of them. Apache, trappers, even the patrols out of Fort Maynard." A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the rain.
The fort? Maren Vail stepped closer. They put a price on us. On both of us, Soren said, turning to face her. Mostly you. Her thoughts spun fast. Why? Shadows moved across his face in the firelight. Because Crowkin did more than throw you out. They're claiming theft, saying you stole cash or papers, saying you ran off with a savage after looting the estate. A bitter laugh slipped out of her, but it never reached her eyes. Of course they did. They've got money, and mouths to go with it. And men believe whoever pays them, Soren said. Maren Vail's hands curled into fists. And you? What's the price on your head? He held her gaze. They say I'm keeping you prisoner, that I killed a traitor last season near Sweetwater.
That I'm a rogue war leader using a white woman as leverage. She searched his face.
Any of that true? The traitor part? Soren's voice stayed level. He tried to sell an Apache child to Pastor Wynn. I killed him with a rock. Maren Vail gave one short nod. That is not a crime. To them it is. He moved past her to a small carved wooden box she had never noticed before. Inside lay a folded sheet of yellowed paper. He handed it to her. She opened it. A faded military discharge from the United States Army, dated more than 15 years back. At the top was a name. Thorn. Maren Vail blinked. That's not your name. It was. Soren said quietly. Before the raids, before the missions, before I went back to the Apache and they gave me another one. His eyes held hers. I've carried both, and neither. She looked at him, truly looked. The perfect English, the reading, the iron controlled in him. The pieces finally locked together. You were raised white, Maren Vail said.
I was raised in the middle, Soren answered. Born to a white soldier and an Apache healer. His voice stayed low, steady. My father taught me letters and law. My mother taught me blood and fire. Both were dead before I was 15. The words came slower now, as if the memories still had teeth. I enlisted under my father's name so I could eat. Fought in border wars. Watched men burn villages and call it righteous. His jaw tightened. Then one day I saw a girl dragged out of a brush lodge by her hair. She looked like my mother. Something in me broke. I killed 3 soldiers that day. Rain hissed against the roof while he spoke. Then I ran into the hills. The Apache found me, took me in, gave me a new name. Soren. It means a spirit that does not bend. He held her gaze. I've been walking the edge of both worlds ever since. Maren Vail stepped closer. Why tell me this now? Because secrets poison the ground they're buried in, Soren said. If we're going to ride out this storm, your enemies, my past, we stand on the same dirt. You ought to know what's under your feet. She folded the discharge paper and handed it back. I don't care what name you carried, Maren Vail said. I care about who stood between me and a bullet when no one else would.
Soren searched her face. You still want to stay? She moved closer, voice low and sure. More than ever. Outside, rain pounded the valley like war drums rolling across the plains. But inside those four walls, two lives had finally collided, not in sweetness, not in comfort, but in raw, unblinking truth. For people like Maren Vail and Soren, that was more than enough to begin building something real. Even in a world bent on tearing them apart. 3 days passed in tense, watchful quiet. Maren Vail spent them sharpening blades until they could shave hair and simmering wild roots into healing brews Soren had taught her, mixtures to break fever, slow bleeding, close a wound.
Sleep came in thin scraps. The wind over the grass sounded more and more like whispers carrying poison. Soren spoke little, but every night when the fire burned low, he spread a rough buckskin map across the table and traced the ridges with a calloused finger. They'll come from the east, he said on the 4th night, voice flat. Your kin hired guns, men who don't waste time with questions. Maren Vail did not flinch. They'd never dirty their own hands, not when money can do the killing for them. Soren gave a short nod. There's a trading post 2 days east. I know a scout there, half pony, half whiskey. Hears more than most. Word is 3 men rode through asking after a white woman traveling with an Apache giant. A bitter edge touched Maren Vail's mouth. They didn't even bother being quiet. She stood. Then we don't sit here waiting for them to come knocking. Soren looked up at her. You want to ride out and meet them? No, she said. I want to be ready when they come. I'm done running. Her voice hardened. I won't be chased like a fox while rich men sip whiskey behind fences they never built. She crossed to the cedar chest and pulled out her father's revolver, checking each chamber with steady hands. Soren watched her with quiet respect. They'll expect you to hide behind me. Then let's disappoint them. They spent the next hours working in focused silence, setting traps along the main trail into the valley. Old war tricks, buried thorn patches, shallow pits disguised with brittle leaves and dust, snare lines braced low where a horse would never see them in fading light. Maren Vail learned fast. She had once spent her days mending fine hems and hosting tea. Now those same careful hands tied knots, set trip lines, and tested tension with deadly patience. She had been raised to pour tea, not build ambushes. But her hands moved with a new kind of purpose. She was done being decoration. On the 5th day, smoke rose on the horizon. Not the soft gray of cook fires, but thick black signal smoke, deliberate and ugly. They want us to know they're coming, Soren said. Maren Vail's jaw tightened. Good. I'm tired of shadows. By dusk, the valley had gone unnaturally still. Too still. Then a branch snapped. Low voices drifted on the wind. A boot struck the ground heavier than any deer. Soren gave a quick hand signal. Maren Vail moved behind the cabin's inner wall, revolver already in hand. Soren crouched low in the brush near the eastern approach. The sun bled out across the sky in streaks of crimson and fire. Then they came. 3 men, riding slow and certain. The first rider was lean and hawk-eyed, his face split with sun-cracked lines like old saddle leather. The second was older and heavier, a shotgun hanging loose in one thick hand. The third was tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven. And Cormac Crow. Maren Vail knew him the instant she saw the way he moved. That lazy, smug arrogance. Barrett Crow's cousin. The same man who had stood over the reading of the will, handed her a sealed envelope with a smile,
and told her she no longer belonged on the land she had spent 5 years helping keep alive. Now he came forward wearing that same smile, only now it held something meaner, hungrier. Soren stepped out of the dark with his bow already drawn. "Turn around," he said. Cormac Crow laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. The savage talks. You're on Apache land." "Apache land?" Cormac Crow snorted. "This whole territory'll be bought and fenced by spring. We're just here on business." He lifted one hand, and the other 2 men spread wide. From inside the cabin, Maren Vail stepped into view. Her revolver came up steady. "Cormac Crow," she said, her voice clean and calm. He froze. "I always knew you were too much of a coward to face me in a courtroom."
So you brought hired guns instead. His eyes snapped hard to her. "Maren Vail, you've been kidnapped. We're here to take you home."
"This is home."
"You're confused, frightened."
"I'm not confused," she cut in. "And I'm not leaving." He opened his mouth to answer. He never got the chance. A sharp snap split the dark. One of the trip lines caught the older man's boot and yanked him upside down. He crashed hard, shouting. Soren moved like lightning. Arrow knocked, string loosed. The lean man dropped with a strangled grunt, the shaft buried deep in his chest. Cormac Crow jerked up his pistol, but Maren Vail was faster. Her revolver cracked once. The bullet tore into his thigh. He went down roaring, clutching the wound while blood spread through his trousers. Soren stepped forward into the moonlight, his shadow long and black across the ground. "Leave him," Maren Vail said, her voice cold as iron in winter. "Let him crawl home." Soren tipped his head slightly.
"That's mercy."
"No," she said, just as cold. "That's a message." They tied the other 2 men tight and bound the older one's leg just enough to keep him from bleeding out. At first light, Maren Vail watched Cormac Crow limp into the trees, pride pouring out of him faster than the blood from his leg. Shame and silence dragged behind him like dust. "You think he'll come back?" Soren asked. "He'll send others," Maren Vail said. "But he'll never look me in the eye again." Then she turned toward the cabin, toward the fire, toward the life she had claimed, not because it was safe, but because it was hers. Soren followed, not as a guard, not as a jailer, as something far more dangerous. A partner. The first fight had been a warning. The next one would be war. Word of the ambush traveled faster than the wounded men did. Maren Vail and Soren knew it the moment they saw the buzzards. They were not circling carrion.
They rode high, in slow, patient spirals, tracking movement through the brush like scouts made of bone and feather. Predators watching predators. The land, as always, said nothing. 3 days passed, each one quieter and heavier than the last. Soren set more traps. Maren Vail shored up the cabin walls with logs and packed earth. They were not guarding a hideout anymore. They were fortifying a home. It had never been built for battle, neither had they. Still, there they stood, sharpening steel and waiting. On the 4th day, a small figure stepped into the clearing. A barefoot boy, no more than 12, shaking where he stood, clutching a sack of smoked meat and a message. "Pate Oren." He spoke to Soren in Apache. 10 men, maybe more, white men. One wore a blue coat, paid the rest in coin and whiskey. A soldier. Maren Vail stood in the doorway, revolver tucked at her waist. "They've made it political." "If the army's tied into this, they'll burn this place to the ground just to make their lies look true."
Soren said nothing. He only handed her the bow he had carved for her a week earlier, never thinking she would need it this soon. Her fingers still stumbled on the string sometimes, but when it counted, she could hold her aim. They were not going to run. They were going to make the land fight with them. The attack came before dawn. No stealth, no patience, only boots pounding dirt, men shouting, torchlight flaring, rifles catching firelight in the dark, as if noise and flame alone could bully the wilderness into submission. Soren met them before they reached the tree line. Arrows cut from the dark like silent thunder. 2 men fell. A third screamed and dropped. Then the gunfire started. Wild, chaotic, panicked. Maren Vail climbed onto the cabin roof, revolver bucking in her hand as shots cracked across the valley.
She spotted the man in the blue coat crouched behind a boulder, barking orders like a hound that had never been blooded. Captain Mercer Flint. They tried to swing wide along the north ridge and ran straight into trip lines and sharpened stakes. One of Flint's men lost a foot in a trap's iron jaws. Another dropped into a concealed pit and never came back out. Dawn started bleeding into the sky, and still they kept coming. Maren Vail fired until the revolver clicked empty. Then she reached for the bow. Her fingers split. Blood slicked the string. She barely felt it. She loosed faster and faster, as if the weapon had been waiting for her all along. Below, Soren moved through the trees like smoke, swift, silent, final. No war cry, no shouting, just breath, motion, and steel. Then Captain Mercer Flint rose from behind the boulder, rifle leveled straight at Maren Vail on the roof. She did not duck. She stared him down and dared him to fire. A shot cracked, but not from his rifle. Soren's arrow punched clean through Captain Mercer Flint's chest. He fell where he stood. And just like that, the rest broke. Flint's men ran in a blind, stumbling panic, crashing through brush, tripping over bodies, fleeing without order and without pride. No honor, no line held, only fear. By mid-morning, the clearing was quiet again except for the wind and Maren Vail's ragged breathing as she stood on the roof, weapon still in hand, smoke curling behind her like a dark halo. They buried the dead far from the creek, not from reverence but necessity. Soren burned the uniforms. Maren Vail cleaned the guns, then laid the fallen soldier beneath the big boulder and marked the place with one smooth black stone. "This won't end," Soren said that night, staring into the fire. "Not all the way," Maren Vail answered. But neither of them spoke of leaving. Something had shifted in the blood-soaked dust. They were no longer fighting only to stay alive. They were fighting for a life. One the army, Krokin, and even the tribes had never given them permission to build. And still they built it, out of scars, fire, stubbornness, and choice. Later, under a sky crowded with stars brighter than any she had ever seen, Maren Vail stepped barefoot into the cool dirt outside the cabin. From a few paces away, she watched Soren tend the fire. His shoulder was wrapped in a rough bandage. His face looked worn thin. But he was alive. Unmistakably alive. She walked to him, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as his equal. "I didn't come here to be anybody's wife," she said. "You're not," Soren answered. She studied him in the firelight. "And you're not mine." "No," he said, "but you're not theirs either." She looked at him then, not the warrior, not the fugitive, but the man who had given her the one thing no one else ever had. A place not to hide, a place to exist. She sat beside him. No vows, no promises carved in stone, only firelight, hard-earned peace, and a quiet that finally felt like belonging. The fighting stopped, but it left its marks. The woods healed slowly around the traps. The clearing settled into a solemn hush. The cabin, scarred by bullet holes and memory, stood taller than before.
It no longer looked like a hideout. It looked like a home. But the world beyond the valley kept turning. News drifted in through wandering traders, horse thieves turned gossips, even a blacksmith's apprentice who could read lips better than most men could read tracks. They all carried stories. Maren Vail was dead. The Apache giant who stole her had been killed in a cavalry fight. Crokin had posted a fresh bounty, this time for silence. All lies. Useful lies. No marshals came. No more hired guns crossed the ridge. To outsiders, the valley had turned haunted. Exactly what Maren Vail and Soren needed. That spring, Maren Vail planted more than seeds.
She strung fence lines, laid paths, built a pen for goats they did not own yet. With Soren's help, she shaped a new table, smoothed it with sand and oil, and set it in the middle of the cabin, like a heartbeat. She was no longer a woman clinging to survival in the wild. She was a woman shaping the wild to hold a life. Soren changed too, though he spoke of it less. He stopped sleeping with one eye open. He began speaking Apache again, softly, while he carved, while he walked the ridges, while he tossed scraps to the hawk that sometimes perched on the roof like a sentry. He laughed more. They stopped talking about someday. Everything they wanted was already there. One morning, Maren Vail found Soren by the stream holding a folded piece of white cloth. She tipped her head. "What's that?" He turned toward her, eyes carrying something old and steady, and held it out. Inside lay a small ring, hand-forged iron set with a polished red river stone. Not pretty by city standards, but honest, unbreakable. "I made it," Soren said. "Back when I first saw you near the trading post, before you ever noticed me. I didn't know why then, but I kept thinking, if peace ever came to this life, it might come with you." Maren Vail blinked, then gave him a small, crooked smile. "Are you proposing?" "No," Soren said plainly. "I'm offering." She looked down at the ring resting in her palm and felt its weight. Marriage had once been a cage for her. Fine dresses, closed rooms, careful silence. "I don't want a wife," he said. "I want you. No cage, no vow. Just your choice." She studied him for a long moment. Then Maren Vail slipped the ring onto her finger. Not because she had to, because she chose to. There was no ceremony, no preacher, no paper, no white dress. But the land witnessed it. So did the quiet few who started finding their way back there, people who, like them, no longer belonged anywhere else. Etta Vail, a widow with 2 small children. Reeve Nolan, a boy with a stutter who could shoe a horse like he was born at a forge. Salma Varon, an older woman with Spanish eyes who traded cloth for roots and medicine. Even Narek, the old Apache warrior who had once told Maren Vail she did not belong, came one evening and set a carved wooden bowl in her hands. "You stayed," he told her. "So now it is yours too." It was not a town. It was something better. A loose gathering of exiles, strays, outlaws, and souls the world had no use for. And at the center of it stood Maren Vail and Soren. Not ruling, not preaching, not claiming anything. Just holding open a place where a different kind of life could exist. Years passed. They raised more cabins, dug wells, stretched more fence lines. The woods no longer hissed warnings. They whispered memory. Maren Vail's hands grew lined and calloused with time, but each night she and Soren still sat side by the fire. No titles, no chains. Just 2 souls who had burned the world's expectations to ash and built a life from what remained. One night, a young traveler passed through, sharp-eyed, ink-stained, asking too many questions and writing down too much. Kean Mercer. At the end of his stay, he glanced between them and asked, "So, are you two married?" Maren Vail smiled, her hand resting in Soren's. "No," she said. "We're something older than that." And that is where the story closes. Not with a wedding, but with a bond deeper than any ceremony. A woman who found freedom where others saw only exile. A man who found peace where others saw only danger. And a love that asked for nothing but truth, choice, and a place to belong. Far beyond the reach of the world that once cast them both aside. Finally, let me offer my heartfelt thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys leave marks on us, and I hope this one left a mark on your heart.
There are more trails ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption under the western sky. Please subscribe, share your thoughts, and ride with us again. Thank you, and God bless.
Legal/creative disclaimer. The stories shared here are creative works and may blend historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools may assist with parts of voice, imagery, or structure, but each published story is refined by human editors and creators to preserve emotional authenticity. We respect YouTube policies and do not create deceptive likenesses or artificial portrayals of real people. All audio and visual elements are used under proper licensing. Any reuse, redistribution, or modification of this content requires written permission. Your presence here truly matters. Thank you for supporting storytelling.